I want to believe in my country. I want to believe in my country, the United States of America, that we can live up to and into the principles upon which this nation was founded, that all men are created equal, and that liberty and justice is for all. Perhaps this seems a timely topic, but for me it is a timeless topic because it arose for me after an encounter I had with a man whom I met during the Civil War. Let me explain. My name is Dave Harrower, and I'm an architect here at the college, and when I'm not working with my colleagues in facilities, planning for the needs on campus for the next semester or the next decade, my passion off hours takes me into the past, doing historical research as a local historian. And it was there that I encountered David Bustill Bowser, an artist, activist, and free person of color. First, some context. How many of you know that in Philadelphia, during the Civil War, 11 regiments of United States colored troops were raised? I hadn't known about this until I walked into my local museum in Cheltenham Township, that's just north of Philadelphia, and came upon an exhibit about Camp William Penn. This camp was in place from June of 1863 until May of 1865. To understand about this camp, we have to go back to the very beginning of 1863, that is January 1st. What happened on January 1st of 1863? The Emancipation Proclamation. Would any of you agree that the Emancipation Proclamation was an altruistic document that freed the slaves? Well, certainly for those who were waiting up on the eve of January 1st, whose lives would be so impacted, it would have that meaning. And as it has come down to us through history, Father Abraham has bestowed this God-given gift of freedom to those enslaved people. Perhaps President Lincoln held some truth to be self-evident. What I would like to share with you, however, is that the Emancipation Proclamation was a strategic military document. Going to that document, we read, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, do order and declare that all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. And you might think, okay, so what's different about that? It goes on to say, and I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. What was this about? The Civil War had begun in April of 1861, and many in the North assumed that it could be ended swiftly. However, by the middle of 1862, it was still going on. There had been devastating battlefield losses, and the ranks of the army that had swelled with the patriotic fervor of men to rush and join the army in support of the cause, they had joined with one-year enlistments, and those one-year enlistments were coming to a close. And there was a concern that the army would not have enough strength and size to be able to continue the effort to prevail over the Confederacy. So one truth which President Lincoln surely could hold to be self-evident was that in the southern states, there were some 4 million enslaved people. And the mere stroke of a pen could potentially solve the problem to the Army's manpower problem. Now, the prospect of putting black men into the Army, black soldiers shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers, was not something that the Army at that time was ready to do. They had no mechanism to receive those men into the Army. And it took them 5 months. It was May of 1863 when they established a Bureau for Colored Troops, that is, segregated black regiments with white officers. They were called United States Colored Troops. And they would be numbered sequentially where and when they were formed. So the 1st Regiment was formed in Washington, D.C., the 2nd USCT was in Alexandria, and the 3rd USCT was in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, this came about because a number of businessmen loyal to the Union cause, members of the Union League of Philadelphia, petitioned, they were led by a man named Thomas Webster, who petitioned the Secretary of War, Stanton, for permission to raise 3 colored regiments. and that permission was granted. So those men went and established a headquarters in Philadelphia for the Supervisory Committee for Recruiting Colored Regiments at 1210 Chestnut Street. And we will come back to this location later. In the meantime, the Army sent out an officer to muster in the troops at this camp to be called Camp William Penn. Now, they had sought a location within Philadelphia, but it turns out that not all the white citizenry of Philadelphia was as ready as were the members of the Union League to receive armed black men training within the city, and they couldn't find a location. And the location that was found was in Cheltenham Township, where I found that museum. And Cheltenham Township, here's a map of Philadelphia. Cheltenham Township is just north of Philadelphia, and Camp William Penn is right in the center of it. The land that they found was in fact given by a Quaker for that purpose. That Quaker is the son-in-law of Lucretia Mott, the noted abolitionist. And to orient ourselves on this map, interestingly, this map happens to show the Haverford Friends School, which is today Haverford College. There are only 2 photographs that survive of this Camp William Penn, one of which is in the Library of Congress, and the other, quite unexpectedly, is in the Quaker and Special Collections of Haverford College. And the explanation for that lies in its caption. Laburnums in 1862, when a colored regiment was encamped on the slope of the meadow at the corner of Washington Lane and Church Road. Disregard 1862. This is one of the things when you go back and do historical research, your correspondence are not always accurate. This was 1863. Laburnums is the name of that house in the background. It was the family home of the Sharpless family, and a Sharpless family member would go on to become a president of Haverford College, and we have on the college campus today a Sharpless Hall. So this photograph came here through the Sharpless family. As mentioned, there were 11 regiments of USCT troops raised over the course of the war at Camp William Penn. At the front of each of those regiments, there were 2 colors or flags, one of which was the national flag, or the Star-Spangled Banner, and the other was a regimental flag, meaning one that identified that individual unit. Thomas Webster, that man from the Supervisory Committee, gave the commission to paint the flags of all of the regiments raised at Camp William Penn to a local artist, and that local artist was David Bustill Bowser. Bowser, born in 1820, was the son of Jeremiah Bowser, who had been born into slavery in Maryland and escaped to freedom in Philadelphia. Bowser's mother was from a relatively affluent free family of color in Philadelphia, the Bustills, and that prosperity afforded David the opportunity for a good education in Philadelphia. With that education, he assumed a responsibility to address the inequities that he saw about the circumstances and treatment of people of color within Philadelphia, within Pennsylvania, and within his nation. He addressed these things by attending equal rights conventions, the Anti-Slavery Society, and he was a member of a fraternal organization called the Grand United Order of Odd Fellows, in which group he rose to its highest rank called the Grand Master. In each of these settings, he came to be recognized as a strong platform speaker, meaning he could be relied upon to stand up in front of a crowd and give a compelling speech. He made his living, however, as an artist and ornamental painter, doing the regalia for the Masonic Masons and the Odd Fellows. He did parade gear for firemen, such as this hat of the Phoenix Hose Company, and this striking portrait of the firebrand abolitionist John Brown. So plainly, he had the artistic talent to be suited to this task. Although I don't know the exact connection between Thomas Webster and David Bustill Bowser, and in fact, this is one of the things as a researcher, it keeps you going back to keep looking. One wants to connect more dots. I do believe that Thomas Webster would have felt that as an abolitionist and an organizer of these troops, he would have felt there was a fittingness to select a black artist to paint the flags for black regiments. The flags themselves are extraordinary. When these two flags for the 45th and the 127th regiments were presented to those regiments, it was written up in the paper and said, the flags are decorated with designs emblematic of the cause of freedom and were painted by Mr. Bowser, a colored painter. What these images are representing are soldiers, black soldiers, boldly going forward in this cause of freedom. Importantly, however, girded by the very principles that founded this nation, as represented by the presence of a bust of George Washington. And we have the figure of Columbia representing America, holding the American flag, giving a blessing to a black soldier heading off into battle, potentially willing to give their life in service not only of emancipation and freedom, but also as a pathway to citizenship and welcome into American society. This is reinforced by, you can see little ribbons above each of the images. These were on all of the flags. They would say things such as, "We will prove ourselves men. Let soldiers in war be citizens in peace," and an ever-present message, freedom for all. One other flag is worth commenting on. This is for the 22nd Regiment of USCT, and it has the message, "Sic sever tyrannis, thus always to tyrants." This also happens to be the motto for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we see in this image a black soldier bringing the message of freedom rather pointedly to a secessionist officer. The 22nd Regiment, interestingly, was called back from the theater of war to march in President Lincoln's funeral procession. As I did my research about Camp William Penn, it's like putting together a puzzle when you do historical research. And as I put together all the puzzle pieces, I had one sitting on the side that I couldn't figure out how it fit into my Camp William Penn puzzle. It was because I had put in a search for the Supervisory Committee for Recruiting Colored Troops and 1210 Chestnut Street. And this is the image that came up. I wondered, how does this fit into this camp about recruiting colored troops? And it does, because this is that address where the Supervisory Committee was. This is an event, and that is a headquarters building scaffolded with draped painted canvases over the top of it. This is a nighttime scene, a celebration. Behind the canvases were 154 gas jets, and when those gas jets were lit, boom, the whole thing would come to light and backlight. We would call this a backlit sign today, but gas lighting was their form of lighting. It would illuminate all this imagery about the struggle for freedom, the struggle for emancipation, and the very foundations of what was important for this nation. But what was the occasion? What would bring thousands of people into the front of this building in November of 1864? And the answer was, it was commemoration of emancipation in Maryland. Well, this just puzzled me, because hadn't we already had emancipation on January 1st of 1863? And here we are 2 years later, and we're having emancipation. What was the delay? It prompted me to go back to look at the Emancipation Proclamation that said that it applied to all persons held as slaves in the states wherein the people there are as of this day, meaning January 1st, 1863, are in rebellion. Maryland was a slave state that had not seceded from the Union. So that God-given gift of freedom that was offered through the Emancipation Proclamation bypassed those enslaved people in Maryland. So, needless to say, that was a cause for celebration. We can understand why thousands of people would gather to celebrate that. I wanted to understand more about that occasion, so I found more newspaper clippings. And in one of those, I found something else that caught my attention. I read, here's a newspaper clipping, I read that the colored population had their own time in their respective localities in our city. Lombard and South Streets, where many of the proscribed race live, were gay with flags flying from all the windows of many dwellings. Well, this made me reconsider what had been that other occasion, organized by Thomas Webster, a white abolitionist, perhaps that had been for white abolitionists. It might have had meaning intended to be about this issue of emancipation, but it stands to reason that the people of color, to whom, such as David Bustill Bowser, whose father had come from slavery in Maryland, there might be a visceral reason to celebrate this in a different way in their own locality. So I, again, kept finding more information about this issue, and I found that there was another celebration that occurred in December. And at this one, there were speeches given. So it's no surprise that the strong platform speaker, David Bowser, was there. And indeed, at this occasion, David Bowser got up onto the platform. But at this occasion, David Bowser didn't give a speech. On this occasion, David Bowser sang. And the song he sang was the Star-Spangled Banner. So David Bowser, this maker of flags, sang a song of tribute to the national flag. He sang a song of tribute to the flag of a nation that had kept his people in bondage, that denied his people the right to vote, that had obliged him on that cold December day to ride to that very event holding on to the outside of a trolley car rather than being able to ride in the warmth of inside the trolley car, merely because of the color of his skin. David Bowser sang a song of tribute to the flag of that nation. Why? I believe he did it because it was his nation. And he believed in the principles upon which his nation had been founded, that all men are created equal, and that liberty and justice is for all. And however much those principles had been thwarted and distorted with regard to his people, he believed that his nation could and should live up to and into those very principles. The actions and faith and hope of David Bustill Bowser are truly, I believe, emblematic of the cause of freedom. And I hope that you are as inspired to learn about David Bustill Bowser as I have been, as we reflect upon the past and consider what we want for our country today and tomorrow. Thank you.